Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Suffolk University, and welcome to the Boston Globe Suffolk University Political Happy Hour. This is a series that we have been running for the better part of the past year with leaders and opinion makers in government, and it's been a great success, and this looks to be certainly no different. We'll have the opportunity this evening to listen to Congressman Seth Moulton and to listen to Josh Miller ask questions and do an interview and hopefully have some participation by the crowd as well. So on behalf of the entire university here at Suffolk, welcome to the event, and let me introduce Josh Miller and Congressman Seth Moulton.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here again at Suffolk University. I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you, with everyone who's watching online at bostonglobe.com. I encourage everyone to sign up for the newsletter from which this event takes its name at bostonglobe.com/political happy hour. But most of all, I encourage you to give one more round of applause to Massachusetts' newest Congressman, Seth W. Moulton. Congressman, thanks for being here with us. So not everybody knows you. You're a Phillips Academy and triple Harvard grad. You volunteered for the Marines before 9/11, served 4 tours, including in some intense fighting, and were decorated for it, but didn't disclose those medals for valor during a tough political campaign until the Globe dug them up. You invited a translator you befriended in Iraq to stay in your family's Marblehead home while you were still fighting overseas. You're known to be an incredibly hard worker, beat an incumbent congressman in a Democratic primary after you had been down 54 points, which is not something that happens every day. You've been called one of Capitol Hill's most beautiful people, and the chattering class has you on track to be a U.S. senator or governor or vice president someday, and you're only 37. It's impressive enough to make me want to have a drink.
I'll join you.
What's been your biggest accomplishment so far?
The thing I'm most proud of is serving in the Marines. The most difficult and best decision I ever made in my life was joining the Marines and having the honor of serving with so many amazing Americans from across the country. And I didn't agree with the war. I didn't think it was the right decision, but I was proud to be there. And every single day in Iraq, even in the midst of a war I disagreed with, my work had an impact on the lives of other people. And that's hard to replace. You know, I frankly thought that I would do my 4 years in the Marines, kind of check that box. You know, you could ask me when I was 80 if I had done anything to serve the country or I wanted to serve. No, I've done that. But instead, I got out of the Marines and I really missed public service. And I think a lot of people feel that way. I know a lot of veterans do. That's why veterans have higher than average participation in civic engagement, in their communities, in voting. But I felt that, and this is the first time in this job since being a Marine that I've really felt like every single day I can help other people, and it's a great feeling.
Do you have any regrets? You've been in office now a year and 2 months.
I mean, look, sure, are there regrets? Yeah, I mean, there are things that we could do better. I mean, there are things I learn every day as a freshman, just sort of figuring out how this system works. There are times when I've been very disappointed at trying to do the right thing on principle, but not doing the politics to back it up. You know, I had an amendment. My first amendment on the budget committee was to increase funding for veterans, which this is a no-brainer. It should be a bipartisan issue. And and all my Republican friends, and I have some actual good friends on the budget committee on the Republican side, just sort of voted against it without even thinking. And afterwards they were sort of passing it, and I said, look, I really wanted you to vote for this. And they said, oh no, that's not the way the budget committee works. You just always vote against things because you're a Democrat. It's like, no. When I proposed this amendment, I proposed it to the Democratic staff. And they said to me, Seth, I don't know if you really want to do this amendment because the Republicans might actually vote for it. That's kind of my point. But I didn't share that with the Republicans, and so they just took the lead.
Never got the memo.
Yeah, they never got the memo.
You've had a low-key, relaxed few days, a work week trip to the Caribbean. Not bad. Tell me a little bit about how your trip with President Obama to Cuba came about.
Well, it was neither low-key nor relaxed, but I'll tell you this. Everybody here should go to Cuba. Everybody here should go to Cuba. And I have heard from my district. I did town hall events on Friday and Saturday in my district. Not one person complained about the trip. An awful lot of people. I had this long list of people who said they'd like to go with me, and offered various services to do so. I'll carry your bags, whatever it takes. But my eyes were really open. It was my first trip to Cuba, and frankly, look, I'm not an expert on Cuba policy. I've thought a lot about foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East and terrorism. I never really thought about Cuba. So I went there with an open mind. But whether you're the staunchest anti-communist or you're a socialist sympathizer on the left, right? This embargo just isn't working. It's bad for the Cuban people. It's, by the way, bad for us as well. It hasn't led to regime change. The Castros are still in power. They're still oppressing their people. But in just the last 6 months, the change has been dramatic. I mean, my colleagues were on the trip. I think I might have been the only one on this congressional delegation who hadn't been before. And they said, look, the last time we were there, you couldn't even use an American cell phone. The Cubans didn't have access to the internet. We met with a lot of bloggers and private business owners. I mean, you couldn't even have a private enterprise not that long ago in Cuba. So this top-down approach with the embargo, by trying to force the Cuban government to change, has just failed for 50 years. And the people who say, well, it hasn't worked for 50 years, but maybe the next year will be the trick. I mean, come on, give me a break. And yet, under a new approach, which could really be formalized by actually lifting the embargo, the place has already started to change in the last few months. So I'm totally convinced we need to get rid of the embargo.
I'm told you played hooky with Congressman McGovern, who you were with, Jim McGovern from Worcester, and you went to go buy cigars. Is that right?
Well, of course we went to buy other things as well, but
of course.
I got a lot of requests. I mean, my barber in Peabody was actually really smart. A few weeks ago, he just innocently, he had a son, and it was a great thing, and so we got cigars to celebrate. So he innocently gave me this cigar. I mean, I don't know, probably a worthless cigar. But then I heard I was going to Cuba, and he said, well, I think I got in return. So he's going to get a much nicer cigar in return.
What was it like? I assume that wasn't part of the presidential itinerary, going cigar shopping. What was it like?
No, but I'll tell you very
on the ground
seriously,
while you were.
It was a tremendous honor to get invited to go on this trip. I just got a call from the White House, and they said the president would like you to come, and it's a tremendous honor. And when I thought about it, I said, well, I'm going to go, we're going to the state dinner. It's going to be the first state dinner I've ever been to. We're going to, hobnob with the president and various officials. We're going to go see the president's speech in front of Raul Castro. These are the things that I thought would be highlights of the trip, and they weren't. The highlight of the trip was going out and meeting the Cuban people. It was walking around Havana, just myself and Congressman McGovern, and going into shops and meeting some shop owners that he knew because he's been there so many times. And just talking to people. The sense of hope and optimism that we as Americans represent by being there was palpable. I mean, every place our delegation went, we had like buses, right? Every place we went, there were hundreds of people lining the streets and waving at us. When we went into restaurants, people wanted pictures with us. One man pleaded with me for my Cuban and American flag pin. He said he really wanted to give it to his wife. And I gave it to him. And that sense of hope and optimism from the Cuban people, that was the most powerful part of the trip. And that's what will lead to real change in Cuba if we can unlock that potential by lifting the embargo.
President Obama in his first inaugural said, "To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history, but that we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist." Right before Air Force One landed in Havana Sunday, Cuban authorities made dozens of arrests at a march of a dissident group, and reportedly about 20 more dissidents were detained on Monday. Do you think this was an American outstretched hand that was met with a communist Cuban fist?
Look, let's be clear. I think we should lift the embargo not to be nice to the Cuban government. I think we should lift the embargo because I want to change the Cuban government, because I don't want the Cuban people to continue to be oppressed by their communist dictator leadership. All right? So it doesn't change the fact that the Cuban government is bad. They're bad news. This is all about how do you change it. I have to say, some people thought that the embargo was just bad news from day one. I think the embargo was well-intentioned. I think it was started, under President Kennedy with the right principles in mind. It just hasn't worked. The Castros are still in power. The people are still living in poverty, are still oppressed. Those arrests are still happening today. I think the way to change that for the Cuban people is to have more interaction with the United States.
Okay, so say lifting the embargo is the right thing to do, but is the visit from the president, is there a danger in that giving what you call a communist authoritarian regime, sort of the stature of it, of the president coming to Cuba without first seeing a profound move towards a more open democratic society?
No, I mean, when Raul Castro had to sit through 30 minutes of the president berating him in front of an awful lot of his fellow Cubans for the behavior of his government, that was not an empowering moment for the president of Cuba.
All right. You were with Representative McGovern. What's your relationship like with the delegation? You took out one of their friends in John Tierney when you beat him in the 2014 Democratic primary.
Yes, so look, I understand the politics, they supported the incumbent, but really under the leadership of Richie Neal, who's a fantastic delegation dean. Every delegation from different states around the country has a senior member who's the dean of the delegation, and some of them are really active and some of them don't do anything at all. Well, Richie got everybody together the day after the primary and said, we're gonna help Seth, we're gonna support him, and they have been nothing but wonderful ever since. And I mean that. I mean, when I need help, the people I go to first, just to figure out where something is around the Capitol. I get out my phone and I text Joe Kennedy. I said, where do I go next? And half the time he says, hell if I know, but he's probably knows twice as often as I do where to go.
What's your relationship like with him? He's the only other congressperson in the 30s.
It's great. I think that there's this sense that we're both young, we're both part of a new generation of leadership for the delegation, but also hopefully more broadly for the country. There aren't very many young members of Congress, and this matters. This matters in our policy. I was speaking to a group, I think up in Lynn, and this was during the campaign, and they were furious at me because I had said I'm open to changes to Social Security, and their argument was, Seth, how can you say that you might change Social Security? It's going to be good for the next 25 years. And I was like, guys, do the math. That doesn't get me to retirement. So I think there's a certain sense in which younger people are just necessarily more invested in the future of the country. And I want to see Social Security work not just for my parents who are at retirement age right now and counting on it, but for my generation when I retire and for my generation's kids and grandkids. And that long-term perspective, I think, is missing from a lot of people in government today.
Do you think it's missing from the Democratic leadership in the House?
Well, I think that there are an awful lot of people who just look at the short-term political gains. And, look, this happens on both sides of the aisle. It's maybe more prevalent with Republicans right now with the prominence of the Tea Party and the catering of the Republican leadership to the far right. But, all across the political spectrum, I think we need more young people in politics.
I didn't ask you, I mentioned John Tierney before. You've been in office now more than a year. How many times have you spoken with your predecessor since you took office, since you took the oath?
Well, after I won the primary, I reached out to him and said, I'd like to work with you to do the transition and everything, and so we met after that.
But since you've become a congressman and were sworn in January of 2015, how many times have you spoken with your predecessor?
I don't think we've spoken since then.
You haven't spoken since you took office. Okay. I want to turn.
Richard Tassay, by the way.
Yeah.
You should ask about him. Richard Tassay is was my Republican opponent. He is quite a gentleman, and he actually introduced me at a fundraiser this past year.
Richard Tassay, the Republican who
ran against me
in November of 2014, introduced you at a fundraiser?
Yeah. So you know what?
Guess he's not running again against you.
Yeah, I hope not, I guess. But look, you can work across the aisle, and you just need to make an effort to reach out. And our campaign, the general election campaign between myself and Senator Tassay, was held up by a newspaper, I forget which, as sort of the model for how politics should be conducted. And we were both very proud of that. And we've tried to live up to that in our post-election time as well. When there's a problem in Wakefield, he's the first person I call.
Elizabeth Warren, I want to ask you about someone else in your delegation. Elizabeth Warren hasn't minced words when attacking Republicans on several issues, including a blistering floor speech about their intransigence on the Supreme Court nominee. She's lit into the opposition party. You came into office saying you wanted to change a broken Washington. Are her no-holds-barred attacks on Republicans helping?
Well, there's a certain part that needs to be played to just sort of offset the unbelievable rhetoric that's going on the far right. And I think Senator Warren plays a very important role in standing up to that and saying, look, this is completely unacceptable. I mean, I share a lot of her beliefs. My approach has been a little bit different. My approach has been to really focus on trying to find Republicans I can work with and find common ground with. And I just think that, in the long run, that's what's needed. But sometimes, when you go into a negotiation sort of writ large, right, you need to have someone who can really hold the line. And I think Senator Warren plays a very important role in doing that. And by the way, we have a great relationship. We try to get lunch every couple of months and we sit down at lunch and we don't, this is not idle chit chat. I mean, we really get into the issues and we don't agree on everything. But we find an awful lot of things we do agree on, and then we find ways that we can cooperate, just the same way that I sit down with Republicans.
Where's one area where you disagree with Senator Warren?
I think that, for example, we sat down in the midst of the trade debate. And I have a lot of concerns with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I've come into it saying I am not going to be just automatically, ideologically, politically opposed to this deal. I want to see the real implications for the people I represent in Massachusetts. And I had two people from semiconductor companies come up to me today and say, we can add hundreds of jobs if we do this trade deal. But I've also had a lot of people come up to me and say, we're going to lose our factory jobs if we do this trade deal. So there's a real balance to be had there. And and I think that Senator Warren's been just from the get-go just completely opposed to it, and I don't think that's the right approach. I mean, I think you have to look at the merits of the deal itself. I'm totally supportive of free trade as long as it's fair trade, but I want to make that judgment before I just take a position on the deal.
So it's a matter of degrees, your disagreements with Elizabeth Warren.
Well, I mean that's just an example, but I think that I can't think of a major issue where I just disagree with her, but I don't always agree. Let me just put it this way: she's doing a fantastic job as a senator. I don't always take the same approach to hopefully accomplish the same goals.
I want to ask you about another partisan issue, and that's the race for president. You were publicly mulling backing Joe Biden if he got into the race. He didn't get into the race. You didn't end up backing him. And you got behind Hillary Clinton. You told my colleague Jim O'Sullivan that it's not inconceivable that we could have a President Cruz or a President Trump, and, quote, we've got to have a strong nominee, and Hillary Clinton is that nominee. I wonder, Congressman, if you're backing her for strategic reasons. That's sort of how you framed it. She can beat Trump rather than a profound belief that her values, her temperament, her record make her best suited to be the President of the United States.
No, look, I mean, it's a fair question based on the statement that you just read. But I think of all the candidates out there today, she's by far the most qualified to be president. I think she'll do an excellent job. And certainly a lot of the issues that are really important to me, I mean, you don't come into Congress as a sort of expert on everything. But I've obviously spent time in the Middle East. I care about our foreign policy. I care about the effects it has for us right here at home, especially the fight against ISIS. And I think that she's been right about a lot of things there, and we need that kind of leadership in the Oval Office. And obviously, when you look at the alternatives, especially on the other side of the aisle, everybody's got to be concerned right now. I had a high school group come in today, and I said, I have never ever been political. I love to answer questions and talk about anything they'd like, but I've never been political before with a high school group. And today, like for example, going out there and saying, you all need to go vote for Secretary Clinton. Never done that before. And I didn't do that today, but I did say this. I said, if you know anybody who plans to vote for Donald Trump, you got to take that very seriously and try to do something about it. And my concern with this presidential election, now this is a serious point. My concern with this presidential election is there are so many Americans who are so just completely turned off by this disgusting politics, by the depths to which these candidates have sunk, led far and away by Trump, like an anchor the size of the Titanic pulling everybody else down. My concern is that all us Americans who are disgusted by this just won't even show up or won't do anything. And the message is, it's time to stand up. It's time to do something. Go volunteer for a campaign. Go take part in this process. Or if nothing else, just find that relative, that crazy uncle, or whoever it is, who actually thinks that Donald Trump is a good idea, and convince him not to vote for this guy. We've got to be active. We've got to be active. This is more important time than any to be active in the political process.
There were plenty of people in your district who voted in the Republican primary for Donald Trump. What's your 30-second pitch to them for why this is a bad idea? You just said it's something that you're passionate about.
My 30-second pitch is that we are a country based on fundamental values that Donald Trump is fundamentally opposed to. We are not a racist country. We are not a country that just says, the hell with the Constitution. I don't care what it says. You know, unlawful detentions, targeting specific religions or ethnic beliefs, not following the Geneva Convention on torture. I mean, these are not American values. And so as frustrated as you might be with the political scene, do not vote for someone who doesn't represent our values. And, you know, and I'll say something else. When you're in politics, one of those sort of like cardinal rules is you never say what I'm about to say. But people should read the history of how Germany elected Hitler. Read that history and just try to understand the analogies. And I think that's important at this time. I'm not saying that Donald Trump is necessarily Hitler. I'm not saying that. But you ought to understand how an unbelievably educated, advanced society can elect a demagogue and how bad it can get as a result.
That's quite a thing to say, so I want you to sort of elaborate on that a little bit more.
I'm already in trouble.
Yeah. You've opened that door. I want to hear a little bit more about that. Walk me through those historical...
You know, there was an interesting piece, I read it. It cited a New York Times article from the mid-1930s that was reporting on Hitler in Europe. And it said, you know, he's saying all these racist things, but everybody says he's not really a racist.
Right. The article said that the insiders in Berlin say he's not really.
Yeah.
That's just
what he's saying. He's trying to, you know, get elected or push the debate or whatever. I think we've got to be really concerned when someone, regardless of his stature as a reality TV star or whatever else, says things that are fundamentally opposed to our values and to who we are as Americans. It's dangerous.
But just to take it one more step forward, obviously for several million reasons, the comparison to Hitler is a pretty inflammatory one. I'm curious if you think that if he were elected president, he would be capable of doing the same kinds of things that Adolf Hitler did.
I don't know him. I don't know that he would. But he certainly talked about carpet bombing the Middle East. You know, that's his approach to ISIS, which, by the way, like, it's just fundamentally stupid. He obviously has absolutely no idea how to fight terrorism. I mean, he's someone who's never done that. He's never had to put his life on the line for the country, but he's absolutely no idea how to fight terrorists without creating more terrorists in the process. So his ideas are not only radical, ridiculous, and immoral, they're also really stupid.
Okay. Final question on this, but so just to be clear on the comparison, you're saying given what Donald Trump has said...
I always try to prove the communications people wrong.
Sorry.
And they're not right. They won't let me off the hook.
Given what he's said and your interpretation that he'd be willing to sort of abrogate some of the basic fundamental constitutional values.
Interpretation, he said it out. I mean, he just talked about torturing people this past weekend.
That he would, yeah, okay. That you see him potentially, if he were to become president, going down a less than democratic path that could lead to authoritarianism and war?
I mean, essentially, his campaign is based on authoritarianism. And here's the other thing, is it's not based on substance. right? It's not like he just has some really radical point of view and he's got a lot of, there's a lot of sort of intellectual thinkers who can back it up, and we may sort of intellectually disagree with it, but at least he's got a point of view. No, I mean, his position is just based on lies and things like saying, what about our economy? We're going to make our economy great again. We're all going to get rich. And then, and you just look at the stuff, there's no substance there. And this is a real problem in our debate. Back to the budget committee, which is a great place for people who don't know how to do math. But we're on the budget committee and we're debating about Obamacare. And one of my friends, a fellow freshman, is Gary Palmer from Alabama. And look, he's a very conservative Republican. He and I don't agree on many important issues. But he's a good man. And he's a gentleman. And he's someone that I fundamentally respect, even though we have important differences and differences of opinion on many issues. Well, he gave a 2-minute impassioned speech against Obamacare. And he talked about how it's raising costs for small businesses, and we ought to have more private sector involvement in healthcare. And it was a good, thoughtful speech. I disagreed with it, but it was a good, thoughtful argument based on facts. The person who spoke after him started her speech by saying, Obamacare raises costs and decreases access to healthcare. Now, we can have a reasoned debate about the first part. I mean, there are ways in which Obamacare is raising costs. But tens of millions of people now have access to healthcare that didn't prior to Obamacare. So my point is that 50% of her opening statement was a lie. Now, how do you have a debate with someone like that, right? And as a politician, as someone who's coming into this with this sort of view that, you know what, I'm not just going to always tote the party line or use the party talking points. I'm just going to try to speak the truth, even when it's things that are tough to hear for people of my own party. It's frightening as someone who's taken that approach to politics, and had, won an election on that approach here in Massachusetts. It's frightening that someone like Donald Trump is doing so well when he just is speaking lies.
What does that say to you about the electorate?
Well, it says to me that the electorate is so frustrated that they're willing to overlook the real substance and just take someone new. I think that's what's going on here. But it's frightening, and I think that it's a cause for concern, and it's why I'm every opportunity to get to vote for education spending, I do.
You had mentioned earlier when you were speaking about Hillary Clinton the fight against ISIS and it being really important, and I want to turn to yesterday's gruesome terrorist attack in Brussels, which the Islamic State claimed responsibility for. ISIS controls a huge swath of Iraq, parts of Syria, can operate freely in an even larger area. It sort of depends on what source you used, how much. That happened under President Obama's watch, who called the group the JV team, a JV team. How much responsibility does he as Commander-in-Chief bear for not thwarting the rise of ISIS?
I think he does bear some responsibility, and I've been cleared saying this. And look, nobody's perfect, and we make mistakes. And I had to fight in a war that was a pretty big mistake by President Obama's predecessor, and we wouldn't even be in this mess to begin with if not for that mistake. So I think it's important to start there. But it's also important to realize that the withdrawal from Iraq was really mismanaged. And it wasn't just that we pulled the troops out too quickly. Actually, I think that was fine. The point is we did not remain diplomatically and politically engaged with the Iraqis. And that allowed their politics to go off the rails, to create this big vacuum into which ISIS grew. And ISIS didn't just sweep in from Syria and defeat the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army put their weapons down and went home because they'd lost faith in their government. So fundamentally, it was a political failure in Iraq. And yet, what was the president's response? The president's response was to send some American troops over to train the Iraqi army. We don't fix Iraqi politics by training Iraqi troops. It's totally missing the point. And if we had stayed engaged in the Iraqi political system with our diplomats, I mean, look, we knew we had to do this. We built the largest embassy in the world in Baghdad, the largest U.S. embassy in the world, and then we left it half full. And that was a mistake. And one of my areas of focus as a member of the Armed Services Committee and as a veteran of the Iraq War is doing whatever I can to make sure we don't repeat that mistake again. Because under the president who promised to take us out of Iraq, 5 years later, we've had to send troops back in. And we cannot repeat that mistake in Iraq. We cannot repeat that mistake in Afghanistan. We can't repeat it in Libya or Syria or anywhere else where we become involved.
You said that the problem was we didn't remain diplomatically engaged, and you called that a mistake. But we pulled out in 2011, right? And Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State for a portion thereafter. Is it her fault?
Well, actually, I think Secretary Clinton has been a consistent advocate for more engagement in the Middle East, even taking some very controversial positions. And I'll give you one example. And this is look, just to be clear, very controversial position. But she said that we should not just let Syria fester, that we have to take some responsibility there. Now, this was a very, very difficult position to take politically back when this all started, because we were just coming off the Iraq War. Everyone was thrilled that we pulled the troops out. The last thing that any American wanted was to get involved in this brewing civil war in Syria. And I certainly wish we didn't have to. But as a result of a whole league of nations doing absolutely nothing, we now have the worst refugee crisis since World War II in Europe. We have a complete, total humanitarian disaster in Syria. And look, this would have been very difficult to figure out. There's no obvious solution with what to do in Syria. But it almost couldn't have gone worse than it has today. And Secretary Clinton, I think, the administration ultimately overruled her position. But Secretary Clinton, General Petraeus, and a few others said, this is really tough, but we've got to do something or it's going to get a lot worse. And frankly, that's exactly what's happened.
Secretary Clinton is seen as more hawkish, and how much more hawkish is, I guess, depending on your viewpoint, but more hawkish than President Obama. Would you say you line up more with her worldview than the president's?
I don't align with being hawkish. As someone who has had to fight wars, I think that I understand, maybe better than most how bad it is to have to do that. And, I think one of Congress's most sacred responsibilities is making sure we only have to send young Americans into harm's way, ask them to put their lives on the line for our country in the most dire circumstances. And I take that responsibility extremely seriously as a member of the Armed Services Committee. It's why I've called for a debate on the authorization for the use of military force. This is a responsibility of Congress to debate whether we go to war and to ultimately decide, not to just pass it off and say, the administration's got this thing from 9/11, it's fine. So I take that very seriously. But I do think it's fair to say that there are times when President Obama has not been engaged enough with the Middle East, and as a result, we've now had to get back in. And it's hard. Look, as someone who fought in the surge and saw colleagues killed and wounded in that, trying to turn this misbegotten war around, it's very hard to return to Baghdad today, and I'm going next week, to return to Baghdad today and see so much of what we fought for and actually achieved. And again, I don't think it was the right thing to go in Iraq in the first place. But the complex history of the Iraq War is that we actually turned it around. And we got Iraq to a fairly governable place in 2011. And to see all that completely gone to waste. I went into a briefing this morning from one of the top commanders in the Middle East. And he talked about military plans in Iraq. And when it was my turn to ask a question, I said, General, with all due respect, I cannot tell from what you're telling me if it is 2016 or 2007. Because this is exactly what I heard in 2007. The same towns, the same strategies. We can't just keep doing this every 5 years. That's the worst mistake. People say, well, I want to take the troops out of Afghanistan. So do I. I cannot wait for the troops to come home from Afghanistan. Okay, can we take them out tomorrow? Yeah, you can take them out tomorrow. If you take them out tomorrow, we're going to send them back in 5 years from now. We cannot do that. And look, this is tough stuff, guys. This is an example of where, the politically easy position for me to take here is just to say, no more wars, no more involvement, no more trying to change regimes. I get the fact that that's just the sort of simple solution here, but it's not a solution. And Brussels is proof of that.
Walk me through that connection.
Because Brussels is, as far as we know, perpetrated by ISIS. You know, ISIS would not be around today if we didn't leave a vacuum in the Middle East.
So what do we do?
So what we do is we don't just go in with a military plan to train troops and drop bombs and kill the enemy. We have a political plan to ensure the peace. And that's got to come first, actually. And then you have that political plan to say, and then the military plan follows that. So we have a political plan to ensure the peace. Because actually, we're pretty good at just like killing terrorists. We know how to do that. All right, what we're not good at doing is ensuring a stable government can take their place so that we don't create more terrorists in the long run than we kill. That's the piece that we've got to get right, and that's the piece that's got to come first.
And with ISIS,
I'm sort of like Secretary Gates. I'm a veteran of the Department of Defense who is a huge advocate for more investment in the Department of State, because that's where we're really coming up short. I had the head of our sort of counter-ISIS messaging program come in and meet with me this afternoon, and because this is something that's really important. Like this is part of the fight. But it's not enough just to drop bombs. And incidentally, this is another example of how Cruz and Trump are just totally out to lunch. Totally out to lunch on what you need to do to defeat terrorism.
Okay, so more diplomacy and figuring out a diplomatic infrastructure on which to layer military activity. But what specifically with ISIS would you do? I mean, it's in Syria, it's in Iraq, there are different sovereign governments involved.
Look, the first thing we need to do is defeat ISIS in Iraq and make sure the Iraqi government is set up for success so that we don't have to keep going back there. That's the first step. Syria is a much more complicated problem. But to a few steps, I mean, we could talk about this for literally 3 hours, but like a few things we need to do. We need to empower a Sunni opposition, and we need to organize that opposition politically. Just take this thought exercise for a second. We've started to become much more politically engaged in the Syria peace talks, for example. But for most of the last 2 years, what's our Syria policy been? It's basically just, dropping some aid supplies and some packages of guns and sending a few special forces in to support some different opposition groups, right? That's basically what we've done. So what's the intent of doing that? I mean, it sounds like if we're trying to just empower some opposition groups militarily, we must be planning on a military overthrow of the Assad government. And yet, if you ask the administration what our policy, they say, oh, no, we're talking about a political transition. Okay, if you want to have a political transition, you better organize the opposition politically, not just give them some weapons and military training. We haven't done that.
Whose failure is that?
It's the administration's failure.
The Atlantic quoted President Obama as saying privately that the first task of an American president in the post-George W. Bush international arena was, quote, don't do stupid Hillary Clinton subsequently said that, quote, great nations need organizing principles and, quote, don't do stupid stuff is not an organizing principle. I'm curious what you think about that.
I agree with Secretary Clinton here. I mean, President Obama's not wrong. I have actually found, from my extensive 37 years experience at life, I found that President Obama's advice is just generally good advice for life, Don't do stupid stuff, all right? Good advice, all right? But it's not enough. It's not sufficient. And we had a very interesting conversation with a journalist in the Middle East. And
this is
when I was over there this past summer. And he said, America will be hated for doing too much in the Middle East, and America will be hated for doing too little. You should always do too much. And we sat down I was actually on the first congressional delegation to meet with President Ghani of Afghanistan, his new president. Really impressive leader, I think, in many respects. And he said he talked optimistically about organizing some Middle Eastern Arab opposition to ISIS. I said, this is exactly what we want to hear. And my question to him was, Mr. President, what can we as Americans do to help you with that? And maybe the best thing we can do, I handed him an answer. I said, maybe the best thing we can do is just get out of the way so you guys will do it yourselves. And he said, absolutely not. He said, even if it's just about America's influence in getting the right people to the table, we've got to have that leadership, and that's our burden of leadership. So I don't believe in sending a lot of American troops to the Middle East. I don't believe in dropping bombs everywhere. but we've got to have more political leadership. We've got to tell people this is how we can come together to make a difference. It's not always our ideas, it's not always our implementation, but our leadership matters. And not everybody has to agree with us, but everybody ought to know where America stands.
Okay, just let me press you on that, because you've mentioned that idea of leadership and in the diplomatic realm. What would that look like in Iraq now? You've spent a lot of time there.
Well, so if you think about it, we had Prime Minister Maliki. All right, Prime Minister Maliki was pretty much the worst prime minister you could possibly imagine. Okay? He believed the wrong things, he said the wrong things, and he did the wrong things. All right? Now we have Prime Minister Abadi, who actually is really aligned with us. He believes the right things, he says the right things, but he just doesn't have the political constituency to do the right things. And part of the reason he doesn't have that political constituency is while we've completely disengaged from Iraq, Iran has come in and taken our place. And they would love to see Iraq fail. So we've got to, I asked the question today, what can we do to politically empower this prime minister so that he can actually accomplish all these good things that he's talking about? We don't. There was no answer. We don't have.
Still working on the answer.
Yeah, they're
Still working on the
answer.
answer.
Yeah.
I want to turn to something else. Your biggest political dust-up here in Massachusetts so far. I want to give the audience a nickel version of it. After the November terrorist attacks last year in Paris, Governor Charlie Baker came out for halting the resettlement, at least temporarily, of Syrian refugees in Massachusetts until the Fed said more clearly how they would screen them or how they do screen them. You tweeted, quote, "It's a shame that Governor Baker doesn't know the difference between refugees and those from whom they need refuge." He knocked you for resorting to, quote, partisan talking points. You hit back on Twitter, quote, "My American values and Marine Corps experience are not partisan talking points. Mass governor should know better." Yowza. Are you sure you're a Massachusetts Democrat? They're not known for hitting Charlie Baker.
I'm one of the only members of Congress who actually does his own Twitter. And so, everybody, oh, Seth, this, what's your plans, this politically calculating, whatever. No, I was just literally, I saw this on Twitter and I responded because I think it's wrong. And at the time, I since learned, actually I hadn't seen any polling data or anything, but I think the Globe did a poll that week and said, according to the sentiment in Massachusetts, I was on the wrong side of the issue because people were scared.
Plurality, 47% supported Baker's position.
Okay. And you know what? Views changed over time. Because I think people, were reminded that this is not what America is about. And I'm always going to stand up for American values.
Do you acknowledge, though, that no matter how long and thorough the process of screening folks is who come in, that it's impossible for the U.S. to make sure that every Syrian refugee is not a member of ISIS or doesn't have terrorist aims?
Sure, and I'll also acknowledge that it's really dangerous to cross the street. So do you think we should outlaw crossing the street?
Okay, I hear you. But help me understand your position. You talked in an op-ed in the Boston Globe about the recruitment value of shutting down the borders, of closing off the United States to Syrian refugees. Is it your position that it's worth the risk to potentially let in a Syrian ISIS person disguised as a Syrian refugee because clamping down on immigration to the U.S. in the face of terror would be a recruiting boon that could threaten America even more?
My point is this. Fundamental to our values is accepting people who are oppressed from across the globe. But in addition to that, it's actually really not a smart strategy in our fight against ISIS to play into these fears and to shut out Muslims from our country or whatever Trump or Cruz or whatever one wants to do, because that will be used as a recruiting tool against us. So the most important point that should be sufficient is just that this is not American.
It's a moral issue first.
It's a moral issue first. But on top of that, it's just really bad anti-terrorist strategy to play into their hands and create more reasons for them to be able to recruit people to fight against us.
I want to pivot to a different kind of moral topic, how you spent your time in college. This is you, I think, your senior year. It doesn't look like you've aged very much, Congressman. This is in 2001. What's the magic elixir?
I don't know, but I do. I'm very proud to be a member of this invitation-only bipartisan working group on Capitol Hill. It's 10 Democrats, 10 Republicans.
Bipartisanship is the magic elixir that keeps you young.
We meet every single. No, I'm getting to this. And we meet every single week, and we talk about places where we can find common ground. And look, if you're a Democrat in the minority in the House right now, it's like the only chance of getting anything done is to find some common ground with Republicans. But I'm also, along with Joe Kennedy, a member of the bipartisan workout group. We meet at 6:30 in the House gym, and it's amazing how you can, develop relationships with your colleagues doing squats and burpees and push-ups.
At Harvard, you were in university choir and sang bass. Is that right?
Not very well, but yeah, I tried.
Are you still a half-decent singer?
Nope.
All right. We
We
won't fact-check that then. Before we get to audience and emailed questions, I have to ask you about an honor that very few people in Washington, D.C. get, and that was the Hill newspaper naming you one of the 50 most beautiful people on Capitol Hill.
The bar's very low.
They wrote, he's served 4 tours in Iraq, hosted a TV show, and earned degrees from Harvard, but Seth Moulton insists he's a, quote, boat shoes, no socks kind of guy. Congressman, what's wrong with socks? Your constituents want to know.
No. My constituents from the North Shore totally agree with me. They don't ask that question.
All right, that's good. That's very good.
The funny backstory to that is that this article mentioned, they asked, what do you like to make? And I actually like to cook. I'd never get to do it anymore, but I'm very proud of my lobster fettuccine Alfredo, which I make from scratch with a Alfredo recipe that my mom taught me, and I sort of devised the right way to combine the lobster and everything. And
Make from scratch like you go down to the dock?
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. So the funny backstory is that since this came out, I've received numerous texts and emails from ex-girlfriends saying, "You never made it for me."
The power of journalism.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to get to some audience and emailed questions, but let's give him a round of applause as we bring those on. Thank you. I got several questions about your work on veterans issues. You've been very outspoken on the VA, and the distillation of the questions I got was, why does the VA suck so much for so many veterans who have done so much great service for this country?
Yeah, my bottom line is very simple. Our veterans deserve the best health care in the world, bottom line. No exceptions. And we're clearly not getting it today. I made a commitment to my constituents, to veterans across the country, that when I got elected, I would continue getting my health care at the VA. And as some people know, care of your newspaper, I went and had surgery back in January of last year, and didn't exactly go.
This is minor hernia operation, right?
Yeah, hernia operation is pretty simple, but actually it exemplified, I think, a lot of what veterans experience at the VA. I had a great surgeon, great anesthesiologist. These are people who had appointments elsewhere but wanted to take care of veterans, so they devoted part of their time to working at the VA. I felt incredibly well taken care of in their hands. But even they said to me, they're like, you got to be careful of the support systems around here. And it took forever to get an appointment. When I first showed up, I walked in the door and gave them my social security number and everything. Of course, the VA is supposed to have this world-renowned medical record system. Well, 20 minutes later, they said, well, we can't prove you're a veteran, but we'll consider taking you as a humanitarian case. And I wanted to say, well, why don't you Google me and you can see I'm a veteran, but I was not playing the congressman card. So I just sat down. I sat down next to guys who'd been waiting there 5-6 hours to get seen by anyone. And then after I had my surgery, I had it in the morning. We had afternoon votes that day. So I kind of woke up from the anesthesia, and my cousin came and picked me up and got my bag of medicines. And the doctor had said, you take 2 Percocets. You might be able to get away with 1, but you'll probably need 2. Well, I went back I didn't take any because I wanted to remember how I voted that afternoon. But then it was really starting to hurt, and so I took one of these pills, and about a half hour later, it's just killing me because all the anesthesia was wearing off. So I guess I need 2. And I went to get a second pill, and I looked a little bit more carefully at the bottle, and although they had prescribed me Percocet, they sent me home with Advil. And I don't know how many doctors are in the crowd, but it doesn't work the same. So this is what a lot of veterans experience. Is many of the healthcare professionals at the VA are actually very good, but just getting in the system, getting an appointment, or getting sent home with the right medications doesn't happen. So we've got to change this. And this Faster Care for Vets Act that I introduced will just enable veterans to take out their smartphones and make an appointment right on their smartphones. This will free up the phone lines for other veterans who just want to use the phones. And the reason it's gotten so much traction is frankly thanks to social media, because a veteran who works for me in my office, Dennis Magnasco, he was just totally on his own trying to make an appointment at the VA and got put in this endless phone loop. And one of the other people in the office said, we ought to make a video about this. And so we made a video.
For people who haven't seen it, why don't you describe the phone loop?
So he's literally, it's like, if you want to see that, press 3. Okay, press 3. Okay, and then get another menu, press 6. Okay, and then get another menu, press 2. And then it looped him back to the beginning, and press 3, press 6, press 2. He was literally in this infinite loop. It was utterly ridiculous. And we posted this on my page on Facebook. It's reached over 3 million people, and we've had veterans from all over the country write in and say, this happens to me too. This happens to me. And so this is a very simple piece of legislation. It's bipartisan. I wrote it together with Kathy McMorris Rogers of Washington. It's gotten about 50 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House. And if the Republican leadership will allow it to come to a vote, we'll give veterans access to something that's available to people in the private sector. And if it's available to people in the private sector, it should be available to our veterans today.
I want to ask you another veterans question, veteran homelessness. What have you done since you took office to help address that issue?
Well, there are an awful lot of issues with veterans, and I think that homelessness is an example of an issue where the root cause. We've done great things to address homelessness. The city of Lynn, in my district, just was declared functionally zero. Zero veterans are homeless in Lynn today, which is a tremendous achievement that's to the credit not of me, but to the city of Lynn. And a really outstanding achievement. But I don't think veterans would be homeless in the first place if we focused more on the transition. Because veterans do extraordinary things for our country, not just risking their lives overseas, but when they get back home. Veterans are disproportionately CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Because if you come home and can apply the things you learned in the military, that leadership training, the ability to succeed under the most difficult, adverse circumstances on earth, well, that's useful back here in the private sector as well. And I mentioned at the beginning how veterans are disproportionately engaged in their communities, take part in government, run for office, volunteer at higher rates than the population. But veterans, in addition to being disproportionately CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, are also disproportionately homeless. So how does that happen? How do some veterans just come back and absolutely excel and become leaders here at home, and other veterans kind of fall off a cliff and literally end up on the street? Well, I think it has to do with that transition, because if you navigate that transition well, you're set up for success. If you don't transition well, if you don't just take care of your post-traumatic stress, which is an entirely treatable condition, then you can end up homeless. And I'll say, look, on a very personal level, I came back from the war and I had a tremendous opportunity. I got into Harvard Business School, and I could go to business school. And even having that tremendous opportunity, the transition's tough. It's tough. It's hard to just come from a place where every single day your work impacts the lives of other people. And then sit in the back of a classroom in grad school and think, gosh, this is like a really selfish sort of endeavor. And I shouldn't have thought. I should have said this is a tremendous opportunity. But when you come from such an intense place like serving in the Marines in Iraq, and you come back to just sort of educating yourself, it's tough to get used to that. So even for me, with all the opportunities in the world, it was a tough transition. And so I'm really focused on helping other veterans make that transition now.
How long did it take for you to feel like you had your feet under you and you didn't have that feeling of?
I honestly, it took a couple years.
Years.
I took a couple years. I mean, I did well, right? And I went to grad school. As I say about my undergraduate degree in physics, for everybody who sees my resume and not my transcript, I sound really smart. So the best grades. But I think I ended up pretty well out of grad school. But it was tough, and it doesn't affect you every day. But there are just some moments when you're sitting there and you're thinking about your friends who are still overseas or your friends who are being sent back, and in those introspective moments, you sometimes wonder, what am I doing, and why can't I still be helping with this fight?
One other question from the audience. Susan McDonough of Linfield writes, what can Congress do to address income inequality?
Congress can do a lot, and this is, I think, one of the most important questions that we face as a country. And it's a great example of a question that many people say, well, this is only about the poor. No, because there's a lot of data out there that shows that everybody is affected, the economy as a whole is affected when there's income inequality. So income inequality is not just hurting the poor, it's hurting the middle class, and it's even hurting the rich. We could be doing much better overall as a country if we didn't have some people making $50 million a year at a hedge fund and other people barely able to put food on the table because we can't raise the minimum wage. So we have got to address this issue. And there are a lot of things that we need to do. We need to reform our tax policy. I mean, I'm on the Small Business Committee. Everybody in Congress says they support small businesses, right? I mean, name me one congressman, maybe the most conservative Republican who says, oh, I'm for big business, right? And yet in our tax system, the small business owners pay 30, 35% taxes. Some of the biggest corporations in America don't pay anything in taxes. How is that fair? I mean, that's just not living up to what we talk about. If you want to say, look, I think big businesses do great things, and I'm just a pro big business guy. Okay, well then fine, then our policy makes sense. But our policy just doesn't even live up to, come even close. It's the complete opposite of what we say are our values. So we've got to fix tax policy. We've got to raise the minimum wage. And counties and cities across the country that have started to raise the minimum wage have not seen an unemployment rise. It's actually, and that's a legitimate concern. It's a legitimate concern that if you raise the minimum wage, we won't be able to employ as many people, and some people at the lower ends will be out of work. Very legitimate concern, but it's not supported by the evidence. The evidence is that when you raise the minimum wage, it helps the economy because those people take that income and they go spend it in their communities.
What's the right balance? What would be a good federal minimum wage that you would support?
I think at the federal level we need to have a floor, but it's very important that's just a floor, all right? Because the minimum wage means different things if you're trying to live in, up in Essex County in Massachusetts, where I represent, and the cost of living is frankly pretty high. Or if you're living in a poor community down in Texas or Alabama, I mean those are different standards of living. But this should be the guideline should be this: a minimum wage should be a living wage. You should be able to live on the minimum wage
at the federal level as well.
And by the way, if more people because if more people made the minimum wage and it was actually a living wage, that would actually save a lot of government money and all the sort of benefits that we have to provide just to keep people afloat.
So just to circle back to the question, you're obviously a federal representative. What's a federal minimum wage that you would advocate for?
I think that about $12 would be a good thing to aim for. But of course that'll change over time, right? And it changes based on what would be really smart is to index the wage to inflation. Right, rather than just having this, knockdown debate about exactly what that number should be every year, let's get some real measures for what a minimum wage should be to make it a living wage, and then index it to inflation. We wouldn't have this infrastructure crisis that we have right now if we'd simply indexed the gas tax to inflation, not raised it, just indexed it to inflation. Right? It is insane. I mean, for anyone who's taken Economics 101 and understands the most simple things about interest rates, it is insane that we're not spending billions, I would argue even trillions of dollars investing in infrastructure right now when interest rates are so low. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. And when you go to any other country across the globe, I mean, we're flying into Havana and look down, and I spent a little bit of time in the railroad industry, so I know a little bit about just sort of the basics of railroads. And I looked down and I was looking at this railroad track that was just constructed to higher standards than most of our lines here in Massachusetts. I mean, that's pathetic. I mean, this is a country where a lot of families make $20 a day, and yet they know how to build a proper rail line. So this is insane that we're not investing more in infrastructure, and it hurts our global competitiveness. These are investments. This is not spending. These are investments that make sense, that will make businesses more competitive, that will ultimately bring more returns. I mean, these are positive investments, and it's crazy that we're not doing them. And by the way, this is why I'm here in Massachusetts. one of the leaders in this effort to take a serious look at the north-south rail link to finally connect the northeast corridor. And let me just take a second to, I think, explain why we need to have this. We need to have this debate, because the governor is very focused on expanding South Station. All right, and there is a capacity problem at South Station. I get that, but I challenge everybody in the room to go around the globe today and find a single city that is expanding a 19th century stub-end terminal rather than connecting lines underground. London right now just approved the third of 3 cross-city rail links. There are about 39, 40 cities that are building cross-city rail links today. And if you look at what they cost, if you look at sort of the average, just like how long the tunnel is and what it costs to build it, it's about the same as what they're talking about for South Station. You know, so even add the Massachusetts premium to that, and it still makes a lot of sense to solve the capacity problem at South Station and also have a transformative project for Massachusetts. If you could get on a train in Salem, where I live, and get to downtown Boston, not in 30 minutes, which it takes today, but about 20 minutes, because it would be electric trains, and then walk across the platform to get on a train to New York, or a train to New Hampshire, or a train to Lowell, or a train to Springfield, I mean, that would be truly transformative for our state. The Big Dig was transformative because it was transformative for downtown Boston. But travel times, you know, improved 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there. I mean, this would be fundamentally different. People, I talk to people all the time in the North Shore who say, you know, I've never been to the South Shore. and it's not just because the North Shore is better than the South Shore. It's because you can't get there. You can't get there from here. You know, it's like going up to Maine. You know, you can't get there from here. You know, you just can't get to the South Shore from the North Shore. It's crazy. But if you could take a train into Boston and continue on that same train to Plymouth or the Cape or wherever else, or the Fall River, that would be, I think, transformative for the state. So the point is, I'm not going to support this project if it doesn't make sense. You know, if it costs $100 billion, I mean, we don't have that money. But we've got to take a serious look at it before we make an investment that I think would be seen by the rest of the world as really, really outdated.
Final question for you. You said that everyone agrees on tax reform, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, in Congress, but it hasn't gotten done for many, many years now. As a low-ranking member of the minority party in Congress and Democrats not having the best prospects for taking back the House, do you ever get frustrated and think, boy, I could do more from a higher office, either Senate or governor?
No. I'm just figuring out how to be a congressman, and I think that, and I actually like this job a lot. You know, I was kind of worried I wouldn't like this job, because I don't have a background in politics. You know, I don't come. You know, I don't have. I mean, the first congressman that my parents met was me, right? So I don't have a political family. I'm still paying my college loans, right? So I don't know if that's a good thing. So we identify. That's good. We identify. Yeah. But it's not a good thing that so many people are still paying their college loans. But I was after I got elected, I said, you know, I thought long and hard about whether to run, about whether to, you know, try to get into public service in a different way than I had done it in the Marines. And I decided I really thought I was running for the right reasons and the right principles. And I think that's what, you know, sort of gave me the encouragement to get into a race that everyone said was, you know, I didn't have a chance of winning. And that all the establishment said, you don't have a chance of winning and you're doing a bad thing. You're doing a bad thing by running against an incumbent. I mean, think about that. I mean, they were basically telling me, do not participate in the democracy that you risked your life to defend. That was fundamentally the message, right? But I was confident I was doing this for the right reason. So I persevered in the election. But then I got elected, and I thought, Jesus, you know, I've never even been an intern on the Capitol Hill. I don't really know. I mean, what if I don't like this job? What if I get there and, you know, I showed up on day one and I gave Joe Kennedy a call and I said, okay, what do I do now? You know, I mean, how does this work? And I actually do like it because, one, I've been impressed by the impact you can have if you just work really hard. You got to work really hard. And there are plenty of people on Capitol Hill who sit in, you know, comfortable seats and just get reelected and don't actually work very hard. One of the great things about our delegation is we have a lot of people who work hard and really have an impact, and that's why the Massachusetts delegation always has an outsized impact on things. But I've also found that, you know, it's a job where you can really make a difference in people's lives. and that's been rewarding. But I didn't know if I'd like it when I got in.
And you're running for re-election this year.
Yes, I am.
Do you have any opponents yet?
I don't yet. I'm sure I will. Everybody. I'm sure the Republicans will run someone, but I don't yet.
All right, everyone, let's give a big round of applause to Congressman Seth Moulton. Congressman, thank you.
Let me thank you all once again for coming here this evening. And boy, I think I speak for everybody in the room when I say to both Joshua Miller and Congressman Moulton, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation. Fantastic. I think for those of us who are getting older, sometimes you worry about what the next generation of leadership will be, who will grab that mantle, who will be our leaders in the future. I don't know about you, but after listening for the last hour, I feel a lot better about that question than I did before this started. If you, just very quickly, if you know anything about Suffolk University, you know we are very much about public policy, and we're very much about public service. It's one of the hallmarks of this university. To that end, I just want you to try to perhaps pick up one of the brochures that are out there on the tables, and I believe in the lobby, because what it talks about is a new program here at Suffolk University called the Campaign Lab, where we are going to be bringing people into the program that perhaps might want to run for public office. Not against Congressman Moulton, but who might want to run for public office and get engaged in the process. So take a look at that brochure. It happens this summer. It happens during June. If you know anybody who's interested, please pass it along. With any luck, this program will produce another Congressman Seth Moulton. So thank you all very much for coming. We appreciate it.